Morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us here at the Data Colada Seminar Series. And today's speaker is going to be Steph Tully from Stanford University. And she's going to be joined by this great set of panelists: Eva Bushell from USC, Hal Hirschfield, Nathan Novemsky, Isha Sharma, and Suzanne Shu. In addition, Joe Simmons and Yuri Simonson will be with us today as well. So with that, I will give the floor over to Steph, and please, we're all very excited to see your research.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be able to be presenting this work today. And I want to thank Data Colada as well as all of my panelists for being here. This is some work that we've been doing trying to understand what we call the psychological ownership of borrowed money. And this is work with Isha Sharma, who's part of our panel, and Cindy Kreider, who I hope is watching from home at the moment. And what we've been really interested in is understanding consumer debt decisions. Now, consumer debt can be really helpful. We know that consumer debt can allow people to buy a home, that it can allow people to buy a car. These can be very beneficial things, but debt can also be really burdensome. And for me, what became really interesting is that people don't just go into debt for the things that they absolutely need. In fact, consumers readily recognize their discretionary spending, things like clothing and entertainment, as a main source of their debt. And so this is really what's been driving a lot of my research over the last couple of years, which is trying to understand what affects consumers' willingness to borrow for discretionary purchases. Now, if we look at what we know about borrowing in general, we know that consumer characteristics can be predictive of borrowing decisions, so things like age, income, household size. We also know that terms of the debt instrument can be predictive, so things like interest rates and credit limits. Where I started my interest in this work was understanding the underlying purchase, the kinds of purchases that people were more or less willing to go into debt for. And in contrast to what mental accounting suggested, which was that people should be more interested in going into debt for long-lasting purchases because they continue to get use from the purchase while they're paying for the purchase. Through a series of studies and an analysis of archival data, Isha and I found that people were more interested and more willing to go into debt for their experiential purchases, even though these tend to be short-lived in nature. Now, through this research, we got a lot of questions about whether this effect that we were finding was specific to a debt form, to credit or something of that nature. And we had analyzed peer-to-peer loans and looked at a lot of different debt types and found our effect to be robust across everything that we tried. But it did get us thinking more about different debt types and thinking more broadly about what is debt at its core. Now, if we look at the definition of what debt is something that's typically money that is owed or due. It's an amount of money borrowed by one party from another. Inherently, it's the use of money that's not yours. Yet, despite this definitional quality, we wondered whether some people might feel as though debt was theirs. And this brought us to the idea of psychological ownership. Now, psychological ownership is distinct from legal ownership. It's really about the extent to which a target feels like mine. Why would somebody feel psychological ownership, especially if they don't have legal ownership? Well, the idea of psychological ownership is believed to be relatively fundamental. You can see it in young kids as early as 18 months. If any of you have kids at home, you might be hearing in the background, that's mine, that's mine. That's psychological ownership, right? And more broadly, it's believed to serve some basic human needs. So by feeling that you have ownership over something, it can provide perceptions of efficacy. It can give you a sense of self-identity or belonging. And so when we look at the early research on this, the early research was really done in organizational behavior, trying to understand feelings towards an organization. So for instance, because I work for Stanford, when I read about Stanford doing something in the news, I might feel like they're talking about my university, even though, to be very clear, I have no legal ownership of Stanford whatsoever. Right? But then Joanne Peck and Suzanne Shu actually did some work to understand how this can work in the world of marketing, and found that merely touching products can provide a sense of ownership. Now, as I said, most of this work is in organizational behavior or in understanding feelings towards possessions, but there's some work suggesting that you can also feel psychological ownership over monetary resources. For instance, Suzanne Shu on our panel here has found that the more that people agree with the idea that they have earned their Social Security benefits, the earlier they would like to start claiming those benefits at, right? And so in this work, what we're going to do is kind of suggest that this is a really interesting idea in the realm of borrowed money. And so we're going to look at the psychological ownership of borrowed money, even though it's inherently not yours, right? And so we define the psychological ownership of borrowed money as the extent to which borrowed money feels like mine. And on one end of the extreme, you can imagine people feeling like, this isn't at all my money, this is the bank's money. And on the other extreme, you could feel like, this is entirely my money, this is just like cash that's in my pocket. And so why should we care about feelings of psychological ownership of borrowed money? Well, we know that indebtedness is an aversive state and that people view obligations as unfavorable and burdensome. So the more that borrowed money just feels like your own money, the less indebted and burdensome it should make you feel. And so higher psychological ownership of borrowed money should increase willingness to use debt. And so what I'd like to do today is share with you some research that we've been doing investigating this idea. The first study is just going to look at natural variation across individuals. And we're going to try to understand, does it predict debt behavior, and how does psychological ownership relate to other potential constructs that you may be thinking about as being related. Next, I'll suggest that psychological ownership of borrowed money can systematically vary across financing opportunities. I'll show you some evidence of that, talk about how you can actually change and manipulate psychological ownership to influence borrowing behaviors, and show you some evidence that it actually influences how people search for financial products online. And then at the end, what I'd like to do is talk to you about some field experiments that we've been doing that I think are pretty exciting, and which we're extending it into some other monetary resources. So in the first study, as I said, we're just going to look at natural variation in people's feelings of psychological ownership towards borrowed money. We're going to look at its ability to predict differences in willingness to borrow and examine its discriminant validity. This study was pre-registered on As Predicted. And the measures of psychological ownership we used were 3 items. Was borrowed money feels like my money, spending borrowed money feels like accessing my own money early, and spending borrowed money feels like spending money that's not mine to spend, with the third item being reverse scored. And so these were levels of agreement with these statements. Our 2 primary dependent measures were their willingness to use a credit card and their willingness to use a personal loan to finance their purchases. So if they needed additional money, how willing they would be to use these. We also had 3 secondary dependent measures. These were their past borrowing behaviors. So whether they had used a credit card in the past year, whether they had used a personal loan in the past year, and whether they'd ever had, and we included revolving credit card balance, personal loan, line of credit, payday loan, peer-to-peer loan. And we used those because those were all types of debt that we could plausibly see as being able to be used for discretionary purchases.
Steph, can I ask a tiny clarifying question?
Sure.
I'd say there's 100% agreement about what a credit card is, but I would have thought personal loan has at least a little bit of ambiguity. Do all of your participants know exactly what you mean, or do you clarify it to them, or is it not necessarily consequential? I'm just trying to.
I don't know that we've ever seen, so I do have studies later in which we explain very thoroughly what the financing product looks like and what the details of it are. We have never seen here that, you know, nobody's ever told us in the comments, for instance, that they didn't know what a personal loan was or something. But that's a good question. I wouldn't imagine it would be as predictive as it is if that were, if people were really confused as to what it was, but it's possible.
Okay, I mean, I don't have any prediction. It's mostly that I know if I was a participant, I wouldn't be sure exactly what you meant. So fortunately, I wasn't a participant.
Yeah. Steph, can I just ask one other clarifying question?
Yeah.
You're talking about borrowed money that's sort of just a pot of money, or because I'm thinking about, like, I might feel differently about a credit card than I do about, say, a mortgage loan, whereas like a very specific purpose for that. Maybe you're going to get to that, but I would feel very different ownership over that. I'm not sure I would be able to answer those the same way.
So in this work, we're trying to look at debt that can be used for discretionary purchases. So we don't look at securitized assets like mortgages or car loans. I think that those would be interesting to look at in terms of, you know, people do feel like their home is their home. So is the money that they use to buy that home more or less their home? I think that those are really interesting extensions to look at. Right now, we're looking at kind of unsecured types of debt that you can take on to buy discretionary purchases. Yeah. And so in addition to measuring their psychological ownership and their debt behaviors and willingness to use debt, we measured a number of other potential constructs. So for instance, tightwad spendthrift, debt aversion, propensity to plan for money in the long run, self-control, financial literacy, materialism, intertemporal discount rates, spare money, and also demographics such as age, gender, and income. Okay. So first, how do people answer the question of psychological ownership? We see that the 3 items that we used cohered relatively well. We found that participants used the full range of the scale. So there were people that rated their feelings as a 1 and others that rated it as a 9, with a mean of 3.3 and a standard deviation of 1.93. Next, looking at how this predicts their willingness to borrow using a credit card or a loan, we see that psychological ownership predicted both their willingness to borrow using the credit card as well as their willingness to borrow using the personal loan. Next, we look at the secondary measures of whether or not they have taken any forms of those debt previously. And so what we see is that indeed psychological ownership predicted who had used a credit card in the last year, who had used a personal loan in the last year, and who had ever used any form of the debt that we provided. Now, I'm going to talk about its relationship to other constructs in a moment, but I just want to note that we measured a lot of different things in the study, and psychological ownership of borrowed money was the only construct that we measured that predicted all 5 of these outcomes. So in terms of its correlations with other things, we did see that it was correlated with a number of the other things that we measured, and many in the way that you might expect, thinking about where these feelings might come from. So the more that you see money, borrowed money in particular, as a means to get the things you want and to be able to afford the spending that you need, you'd expect it to be higher, right? And so we see that people who rate themselves more as spendthrifts and who have a higher desire to spend do indeed have higher psychological ownership of borrowed money. We also see that people with less spare money, right, who might have a greater need for borrowed money in order to meet their needs or whatnot, they also have higher psychological ownership of borrowed money. Similarly, if you think about, you know, the self-identity component, right, if you see borrowed money as inherently bad, right, as you would with people who are debt averse, then you'd expect that they have lower psychological ownership of borrowed money, and we see that relationship as well. So we do see a number of relationships across these constructs, but importantly, we did a confirmatory factor analysis for each of the constructs that had at least 3 items, which was basically everything other than demographics and the intertemporal discounting rate. And for all of these, we see that the model with 2 factors outperformed the model with 1 factor, suggesting that psychological ownership of borrowed money is a unique construct that is not the same as any of these types of things that we measured.
Steph, this is an interesting set of correlations, and I'm particularly interested in financial literacy. Seems to correlate very low, and you know, I'm just wondering if it doesn't have anything to do with, you know, many of these things. Do you have any idea what is underpinning psychological ownership? Maybe we'll get to that later.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that. We have some evidence of at least one process, and then at the end, if there's time, I'll talk about a lot of the processes. So I think that this work is really trying to show that we need to think about psychological ownership of borrowed money as a construct, and we were trying to look at how predictive it is and understanding whether it's important. But I see it as the tip of the iceberg, and I really think that we need to do, and I hope other people need to do, a lot of research to understand what are the main drivers. I'll note, so financial literacy is not significant here. We have seen it be significant in other studies. It's never super high. We have seen some correlation with it though. And I will note that for some reason in this study, financial literacy was relatively high. among these participants. And I think that that might have somewhat dampened the ability to find the relationship with financial literacy in this study.
Steph, can you also talk a little bit about how income affects this? Because there's like a need for money, but then there's also an ability to pay it off. And if I have an ability to pay it off, I might like feel like I have greater ownership.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually really consistent with some of the things that we've found. So you'll see here, there is no significant relationship with income. And I think that that can be explained in part by these kind of competing forces, where on one hand, when you have less money, you might have a greater need or a perceived need for borrowed money. It can help you meet your needs or help you meet your spending obligations more easily. But we've also seen in some studies that psychological ownership relates to a lower concern over repaying. And if you interpret the reduced concern over repaying about perceptions of efficacy in terms of repaying, I know that I'm good for this, right? So I'm just using my future money because I know that I'm good for this money. Then if you interpret the concern for repaying in that way, then that's like a competing force on income, where people of higher income are more likely to believe that. And then overall, we don't see a significant relationship. That's a great question.
Steph, sorry, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Hal.
All right, well, just real quick, have you looked at education, or maybe you will in your future studies, but I would want to know about education. Also, maybe, so I know there's the financial literacy scales, but are there sort of specific measures we could look at knowledge about debt per se? Maybe you get at some of that with the past experience with debt, but I could imagine somebody who really knows about debt and knows that there's good debt, bad debt, et cetera.
The good debt and bad debt we haven't looked at explicitly, but I will say, so we have a conceptual replication of this study where we give people a personal loan ad from American Express. We look at their interest in applying for the offer with very similar results. And in that one, we directly ask people whether they understand that money needs to be repaid, right? Whether they fully understand. And we see, and I'll show you in another study later as well, that this isn't explained by whether or not people understand that it's their money or that they have to repay it, right? People overwhelmingly get that this is money that they are going to have to repay to somebody else. So it's not just, do you get it, but it's this feeling of whether it's yours or not.
And what about education? Is that something you control for?
I don't think that we've seen a significant relationship with education. I don't know that we measured it here, but I do think we have it in other studies, and I don't think that we see a significant relationship with that. But I can double check that. Suzanne, did you have a question as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to, and I'm going to jump ahead a little bit for a second here, but one of the things I really like about this is that it does sort of get us thinking about the idea of psychological ownership, not just for borrowed money, which is your main focus here, but all kinds of forms of money, and how that might relate to all these other measures that we have about how people think about money. And, so things like self-control and materialism and planning, right? The fact that you are finding these relationships is really quite interesting, even though they are separate factors. And this whole project just gets me thinking about psychological ownership for all types of money. And I know later on at the end, you'll get to other forms of money, but just to give you an anecdote, Joanne and I, way back when we started using psychological ownership in some of our work, we got pushed by reviewers on sort of separating psychological from legal ownership. And we did a small study that I don't think ever got published with a whole bunch of different items. And one of the items was a dollar bill out of your pocket. What was your legal ownership and your psychological ownership, to show that those two things weren't necessarily, on top of each other at all times. And people feel very high legal ownership over the dollars in their pocket, the physical dollars, but very low psychological ownership. And I think because you give up that physical dollar and you get another one, and who really cares, unless it has some sort of sentimental value. So thinking about psychological ownership for money, here for borrowed money, you'd also think about for taxes, right? Individuals who feel very high psychological ownership over the money that they paid for their taxes are, I would guess, the ones who fight the most about having to pay taxes at all. And, you can imagine a paper like the, I think it's 2011, Sussman and Olivola, about responses to sort of like tax-free holidays that retailers offer, and looking at the measures that you've got here, psychological ownership, not just for borrowed money, but for any money. Does that on an individual level drive how responsive people are to those other kinds of offerings, like tax-related, debt-related, other kinds of, governmental money, and I know you're going to get to that later. So I really like how this all comes together, and it opens up so many ideas for future research.
I mean, I love that comment, because I think that dollar bill study you ran is so interesting. In fact, we had talked about it in current assets, and we were worried that psychological ownership of the money that you have would be too high. So I think that's so interesting that you find that the psychological ownership over $1 in your pocket is not necessarily that high. But yeah, I agree. And hopefully through the end of the talk, you'll see that this seems to be a really strong driver of consumers' decisions. And so I think that there's a lot of work that can be done understanding that. I will talk about government benefits. Like, you can also imagine like petty cash and company money, right? Joint bank accounts. I think that there's a lot of interesting things in there in which, psychological ownership could become really important and interesting to understand. And yeah, I'm really hoping I can get to where we do some interventions with tax money as well. Yeah. So what I've shown you so far is that psychological ownership of borrowed money is predictive of debt behaviors. I've shown you that it isn't the same as the existing constructs that are known, but we do see that there are relationships with the existing constructs, and many of those existing constructs do predict at least some of the debt behaviors. So one possibility is that, the predictive power of psychological ownership in predicting debt behavior is merely a function of its relationship with other things and picking up on those, unique variances, those variances that those other constructs have with willingness to borrow. And so what we wanted to do next was look at whether psychological ownership added any unique predictive ability above and beyond these constructs. And to do this, we used a hierarchical stepwise regression. Now, what this does essentially is, because we a priori had no theoretical reason to decide which of these factors would be predictive in determining willingness to borrow, we added all of the possible predictors other than psychological ownership into a first block, and allowed the model to determine which of those factors were significant in predicting willingness to borrow for a credit card. And then in a second block, we told the model, add psychological ownership, but only add psychological ownership if it adds predictive power above and beyond whatever other predictors are significant. And so what we see is that for willingness to borrow with a credit card, their tightwad spendthrift tendencies, debt aversion, their gender, and their discount rate were all significant predictors of how likely people were to use a credit card to borrow. But importantly, above and beyond all of those factors, psychological ownership was added to the model in the second block, suggesting that it added unique predictive ability above and beyond those measures. Then we do the same thing with willingness to borrow for a personal loan. Now, you'll note here that there are different predictors that are determined to be predictive of personal loan behavior as compared to credit card behavior. So here we see debt aversion, discount rate, age, and materialism. But importantly, above and beyond these factors, psychological ownership significantly predicted their willingness to borrow with a personal loan. Now, I've provided some evidence that this varies on an individual level. What I'd like to suggest now is that there's also systematic differences across financing opportunities, across contexts. And in this work, we're considering a very basic difference across financing opportunities, which is the debt form that it comes in. Now, the most common forms that consumers have available to them to make discretionary purchases are those in the form of credit, a line of credit, and those in the form of a loan. Now, in economic terms, credit and loan can be interchangeable, right? So all lines of credit are definitionally loans, even though we don't necessarily always think about them the same way. And loans can be revolving in nature, and if structured in a specific way, can be a line of credit. And I'll give you an example later in the marketplace of how they can actually be used interchangeably. However, debt forms are often named in part due to common differences in structural properties, and we believe that some of these differences are likely to impact psychological ownership. That is, we suggest that relative to loans, credit is likely to be higher in psychological ownership. Now, the first and most basic reason that we suggest this is that compared to credit, loans are more closely linked to the actual owner of the funds, the lender, right? Both conceptually as well as semantically, right? And so they may be more likely to prompt ideas about the true owner of that money. There may also be differences in efficacy. So to the extent that credit is more readily accepted by vendors, right? You don't need pre-approval for purchases, maybe to the same extent that you do for loans, then you might feel that this credit allows you to make the purchases you want more readily, and so it can provide perceptions of efficacy. And then in terms of self-identity, there's reason to believe that credit cards may confer a more positive sense of self-identity. So for instance, research shows that credit cards can convey a sense of personal wealth and status, and that consumers can use their credit limit as a signal of their future earnings potential. And so we actually, test these ideas in a pilot study. In this pilot study, we first asked people to list the first 3 words that came to their mind when they heard the words credit card or personal loan. And then we coded the open-ended words for whether they mentioned a lender, whether a lender had spontaneously come to mind, right? So words like bank, broker, lender, credit union, Visa, MasterCard, Amex, American Express, right? Any type of lender. And what we see is that participants asked to think about the personal loan were significantly more likely to mention a lender in their open-ended responses as compared to participants asked to think about a credit card. And so we think this is consistent with the idea that a loan is more conceptually and semantically related to lender and prompts thoughts of the legal owner of the funds. Next, we asked people to write a fictional story about somebody using a credit card or a personal loan to make a purchase. And after we did that, we gave them 8 potential avatars. We asked them to think about the main character that they had written about in their story and to select the avatar that most closely represented the main character in their story. And we designed these avatars such that in a pretest, the 4 above were rated as being less efficacious and having a more negative self-identity, and the 4 below were rated as being more efficacious and having a more positive self-identity. So what do we find? We find that participants writing about somebody using a credit card selected the avatar, were more likely to select an avatar that was more efficacious and had a more positive self-identity compared to those writing about somebody using a personal loan. Now, you might wonder, like, is this just because people are thinking about using a credit card and paying it off immediately, right? We've done a replication of this where we specifically have them write about somebody who has a revolving balance on a credit card or an outstanding balance on a personal loan. We find the same results. And so, this pilot study provides some reasons to believe that credit may be higher in terms of psychological ownership than loans, and this is what we're going to test next. So we're looking at differences across debt types in terms of their psychological ownership, and this was done with students at Dartmouth, where we simply asked people to imagine getting access to a line of credit or a loan, and they indicated their psychological ownership using this scale, right? Where we ask people, these funds would completely feel like they belong to another entity or would completely feel like they are mine to spend, right? And so we're doing this in part because we want to make sure that, we've measured it with a scale before. We have other studies that do measure it with a scale. We're trying to show that this isn't about any specific wording, right? But we're trying to get at the concept and the idea of psychological ownership in a lot of different ways. And so we find—
Steph, can I just ask real fast? Sure. Do you hold the interest rates constant here, or
not in this study, but in the next study, I will do that.
Okay.
Yeah. So
I just didn't know if people have different perceptions of these different things.
I think that's a great point. I mean, so for what it's worth, in the real world, credit cards have significantly higher interest rates than personal loans, but it's possible that people don't know that, right?
That's what I was thinking, exactly.
Yeah. So here we literally strip everything away and we just tell them that they get access to a line of credit or a loan, and we give them no other information. And in the next study, we'll add some information. In the next study, we'll try to hold everything constant. And so we'll continue to try to add those things in to kind of separate these structural properties from just these, framing effects of credit and loan. But what we see is that when people are asked to think about getting a line of credit, they indicate feeling greater psychological ownership over those funds relative to those asked to think about a loan. Now in study 3, we're going to do a conceptual replication of this. We're going to hold a couple more things constant, including the amount and the interest rate. And we're going to try to get at psychological ownership in yet a third way. So here we ask them to imagine that in addition to their current savings, checking, and credit card accounts, their bank gives them an additional either line of credit or loan of $500. We explain that with this line of credit or loan, they can spend up to $500 per month in advance of their monthly paycheck. They can pay back as little or as much as they'd like, and any remaining balance will incur a 15% interest rate, right? And so our measure of psychological ownership here was asking them to reflect on and consider how getting access to this line of credit or loan made, affected their bank account, made them think about their bank account. And so the idea is that if they choose the one on the left, they see this money as getting money that's being added to their account. It's their money, right? If they choose the one on the right, it's money that is going to be taken out of their account. It's now money that they owe to somebody else. And so what do we see? We see that participants asked to imagine getting access to the line of credit were significantly more likely to see it as money that they got added to their account compared to those asked to imagine getting access to the loan. So we've tried to hold constant the amount and the interest rate, but it's still possible that other structural differences across credit and loan could be influencing these things. For instance, line of credit, you often don't have to start repaying until after you've spent the funds, right? Also, credit, if they're thinking about credit cards, right, they might be thinking, oh, I'll get a card, it'll be very easy to use, whereas a loan, I would have to, get money from the bank. And so we're going to try to hold all of those different components here constant and just look at the labeling of flex loan or credit. And we're going to examine whether differences in psychological ownership impact differences in uptake across debt forms. And this was pre-registered on as predicted. And so what we're doing here is we're taking advantage of the fact that, while loans and lines of credit can often be different, they don't have to be. So this is a true offer for a flex loan. And what you'll notice at the bottom is that it is an open-ended line of credit. And so there are times in which loans can serve as lines of credit and vice versa. And so first, we asked participants to think about a fun but unnecessary purchase they wanted to make for themselves that would cost between $50 and $1,000. Now, we do this because we wanted to ensure that this wasn't driven by people thinking about different uses for loans versus credit. So we wanted to first make sure everybody was thinking about whatever use that they would do. You'll see some examples on that little notepad of what people wrote about. And then we manipulated their thoughts of it being a loan or credit offer. And so we take this and adapt it from the actual flex loan offer you saw earlier, and we give them a little marketing blurb about what it is, but we either call it a flex loan or flex credit. And so we explain what that is, and then we also give them a lot of information, and we've told them in advance they're going to answer a lot of questions about this, so they needed to read the offer carefully, and we tell them the amount, we tell them that they only owe money once they spend it, that it's revolving in nature, that it's available on a convenient card that can be used anywhere where Visa or MasterCard are accepted, and we have another number of comprehension checks to make sure that they fully understood this. And then we asked them to think back to the purchase they had written about and indicate how willing they would be to use, to consider using this flex loan or flex credit offer to make that purchase. We asked them, we got at psychological ownership using a 5-point scale in this study. You'll note the first 3 are identical to the questions that we asked in study 1. We also added 2 others that we thought might reflect psychological ownership as well. The results are the same with or without those last 2 measures as well. And so as I mentioned, there were a number of comprehension checks, right? There was a lot of information given to them. Do they actually understand that? So we asked them whether they, the offer that they got was revolving or not. 98% of them got that correct. Whether they had to start paying the flex loan immediately or whether it was only after they spent the funds. 98% understood that it was after they spent the funds. Whether it was available on a convenient card accepted anywhere where Visa or MasterCard were accepted. 96% of them got that correct. And also whether they remembered whether it was flex loan or flex credit, just to ensure that they had paid attention to that, and almost everybody got that correct. And so none of these responses varied by condition, suggesting that everybody understood the structural properties of this financing offer. So what do we see? Even though that they're structurally identical, people here are still significantly more willing to consider using this option when it's labeled as a flex credit offer as compared to a flex loan offer. Moreover, we see that they differ significantly in terms of their psychological ownership towards these offers, and that these differences in psychological ownership in part explain the difference in their willingness to use or consider using the offer to fund their purchase.
Sorry, Steph, I have a question.
Sure.
So the fact that everything is held constant suggests that you basically, based on the fact that people otherwise have associations with these different types of debt, you can now frame these differently as either debt or credit, right? Like, but it's based on otherwise, or like other associations that people have with these types of loans.
Yeah, so I think that in the real world, right, this is likely multiply determined, right? And some of these common structural differences probably relate to even bigger differences than what we're seeing in this study where we've held everything constant. But I think this study suggests that even when you do hold this constant, right, there are these differences just by labeling it either flex credit or flex loan. And what we think is the reason is in part because of the idea that the loan is semantically and conceptually more related to the true owner, which makes it a little bit more difficult to really think about it as your money. And that's what we're actually going to try to leverage next in order to manipulate psychological ownership and actually test that.
So, Steph, can I just ask a quick question? Imagine you, and this is kind of building off of both Ava's comment and Leif's earlier about not really understanding what a personal loan is. And so imagine you created two products that didn't have any label at all. So it wasn't called loan or credit, line of credit, but you sort of described it in the same, in similar terms, product A, product B, or something like this. That would be like, in my opinion, that would be the most controlled I think you could do, because then you wouldn't have to worry about the sort of prior associations there, or maybe that's not a concern to you, but is that, are you worried at all about just sort of these, in some of the work that I've looked at with personal loans, I find that people just don't really know what they are. They're a little unsure of them. And so I worry that that could be popping up here in some way.
So we don't always use the term personal loan. Sometimes we just say loan, right? And we see the same effect. So it doesn't seem to be about the personal component specifically. And we've also used like real debt offers for like a personal loan from American Express where you know that this is a real product and things like that. The difference between credit and loan isn't something we see necessarily as problematic. It's actually what we think is really important in understanding. I think if you stripped it away, natural variation there still would matter. Right. So if you took all of that away, I mean, in study one, we don't give them any information about an offer. All we ask them is their psychological ownership of borrowed money, right? Without using the word loan, without using the word credit or anything like that, right? And we find that the natural variation on that measure predicts their willingness to use a number of different debt forms. So I don't think that this is, what we're showing here is specific to credit and loan. And I think that it is much broader and bigger than that. But at the same time, I think that credit and loan is really interesting and important because, and what I'll do here is actually look at this. Most of the time, credit cards have significantly higher interest rates and are much worse for consumers. And in part, some of the study ideas came from, I got an ad for an American Express personal loan, and I'm looking at the interest rate, and I'm thinking to myself, man, people use their credit cards to buy their Christmas purchases. This was like, trying to get you during Christmas time to use a personal loan to buy them. And it was like, why wouldn't consumers use a personal loan? Like, if they're not going to repay this, they should just be getting a personal loan to put their purchases on, and they could save so much money. It's a 7% interest rate instead of a 25% interest rate, right? And so I think that the credit loan, I don't see as much as a confound or a problem as part of what makes this really interesting and important.
Steph, I wanted to jump in for a second as well, just to mention two things. One based off of Hal's comment and the other based off of a question that came through. So with respect to Hal's comment, and I think study 5 will speak to this as well, we happen to find that psychological ownership differs across credit and loan, but this study 5 will also show how you can manipulate psychological ownership separately from credit and loans. So I think that might answer part of that question as well. And it relates to a question that came up that might be worth talking about, and I think study 5 will get to it. But somebody asked, in any of your studies, did you try to frame the same product as debt? For example, a credit card could be framed as money that you can access or money that you owe. Does the product have to be different, or can you also frame the same product differently in psychological ownership? So I thought those two questions tied really well together.
Yeah, I think I will answer that with this study. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but if there are additional questions about it after this study, you know, I'd be happy to talk about it. But that's exactly what we're trying to do here, is that we look at credit loan, but then we use terminology just to try to change the psychological ownership of that money. And so what we do is, in a control condition, we vary credit and line of credit and a loan. Right, so we ask them to imagine getting access to a flex loan or flex credit line of $500, right? And here, I just want to point out, we did actually vary the interest rate such that the credit line was significantly higher in terms of an interest rate relative to the loan. So the credit line here had a 15% interest rate, whereas the loan only had a 10% interest rate. And again, we just call it a loan, not a flex personal loan or something like that. But then, you know, to the extent that what we've suggested is that this is because people naturally think about the lender more often when thinking about a loan, we wondered if by really having people think about the fact that this is somebody else's money, we could reduce interest in the credit line specifically. And so what we did is we added another condition in which we added terminology that was lower in psychological ownership. So this you know, reminded people that this was really borrowed money, and that it temporarily lets you borrow money that belongs to the bank. And so we're just trying to prompt these thoughts that we think already happen for loans more so than credit. And if so, this terminology should be particularly effective at reducing interest in the credit, but less effective in reducing interest in the loan. And so what do we see here? Now note, again, the interest rates favored the loan, right? And so if people were doing this purely on economic terms, people should be more interested in the flex loan than the flex credit. However, we see that despite these differences in interest, people were significantly more interested in the flex credit option compared to the flex loan. Now, what happens when we introduce thoughts about the fact that this is really borrowed money that you're temporarily using from a lender? Now we see no differences in in interest. So here, once we've reduced the psychological ownership of the credit offer, right, we see that they are equally interested in the flex credit product as the flex loan option, and that this is really coming from a reduction in interest in using the credit product as compared to a reduction in using the loan. And so I think this speaks to the idea that it doesn't just have to be a credit loan manipulation. It doesn't have to be structural in nature. Simply reminding people that this is borrowed money seems to impact their willingness to use credit. So if this is the case and people have different psychological ownership for credit and loans, we wondered whether this would impact more than just their interest in using it, but also how they search for products. And so what we did here is we actually examined online search patterns for credit cards and loans. And so we came up with terms that could plausibly be paired with both credit cards and loans. So my credit card money, my loan money, right? My credit card cash, my loan cash, repaying a credit card, repaying a loan, right? And we pre-tested these in terms of their psychological ownership. Right? So we asked people to what extent the phrase felt like it was talking about somebody's own money versus money that's not about them, that does not belong to them. And then we had pre-registered that we'd take whatever were the highest 5 and the lowest 5 terms in terms of psychological ownership. And so you can see these bolded with the little star above. Those are the terms that we use in this study. And what we did is we used Google search trends to look at the relative search volume for these different search pairs. So for the term my money, we looked at the relative search volume for my credit card money versus my loan money over a year-long 52-week interval. Okay, and so what we're predicting here is an interaction. Our theory is predicting an interaction. When you're searching for a credit card, you should be more likely to use higher psychological ownership terms. But when you're searching for a loan, you should be more likely to use lower psychological ownership terms. And so that's what we're exploring here with this analysis. We do include search term pair fixed effects to account for any heterogeneity in the actual search term pair. So whether my money is particularly influential or has a bigger effect, things like that. And then we also controlled for weak level heterogeneity via weak level fixed effects. And what do we find? Indeed, we see that credit cards are searched more often than loans when they're accompanied by high psychological ownership terms. But loans are searched more often than credit cards when accompanied by low psychological ownership terms. And so before I go into the extension into other resources, I just wanted to mention that, you know, we see this work as really a starting point in understanding psychological ownership of borrowed money. But we believe that this work shows that people can experience psychological ownership of borrowed money, and that these perceptions are important and predict interest in using debt above and beyond established factors that have been considered previously. I feel like Hal has a question.
I just ask, it's a really dumb question, but imagine,
go for it.
Imagine a loan. So credit card has a physical card. I'm drawing off of, you know, some of Suzanne and Joanne's work, right? Yeah. So, and loans, I mean, I guess you could, I don't know, like what if I had a physical card for a loan too? Would we see these same effects? I'm just trying to figure out like what some of the source of this could be.
So in the real world, I absolutely think that that can relate to it, you know, and in fact, you know, Isha and I have talked about the fact that with Amex, they remind you that you've been a card member since a period of time, which, you know, can relate to your longevity with the company and things like that. In study 4, the Flex Loan study, we actually told everybody that the money would be made available on a convenient card accepted everywhere where Visa and MasterCard were accepted. And the participants understood that. And so we still saw the effect when you think about it being on a card. But in real life, I imagine that that does contribute to this effect, right? It's in your pocket, it's in your wallet. You know, I think that that likely does contribute in the real world, but even stripping that away, when people at least imagine having access to that card, we still see it.
Can I also ask a question from the audience, which is, and I think this is an interesting question, but like once the money is spent, like once you did spend the money, like what are your predictions in terms of like how that influences like perceived ownership over the stuff that you've spent on, given that loans a lot of times are spent on like very big purchases that have.
So do you mean, sorry, I just want to clarify, do you mean the psychological ownership over the things that you buy with that, or do you mean
when you're
how
still
does your
actually
psychological
owing
ownership of the funds change once you've spent them and now you owe them?
So like imagine you're like, so people have like high perceived ownership over their cars, I feel like, and their houses, even though they technically belong to the bank. But then with credit cards, people buy like, I don't know, random stuff from Amazon. Like, are there different, once the money is spent, like, does that then translate differently for different loans, or just kind of like what are your predictions in terms of like of the things that we buy with, like how much ownership do we perceive over the things that we buy with credit or loans?
So I think it's a really interesting question whether it translates to the things that you actually buy with it. We haven't actually started to look at that yet because we've been interested in the psychological ownership over the money itself. And I think that there's even questions about how that might change once you've spent that money, right? So if you, if you use money to, buy something on Amazon, right, and then you get your bill and you're seeing how much you owe, do you feel differences in psychological ownership towards that money that you've spent? And I think that also, knowing that might also inform how you would feel then about those purchases, right? And so if that's still connected, right, if you're still thinking about the psychological ownership that you have over the funds that you've previously spent, I could see that impacting the psychological ownership you feel over the possessions. Whereas if you don't, we've been focused on the psychological ownership over like available money to borrow. If you don't then see it as your money once you've spent it, or if there's no variance on that, or if that changes, then I think it would make different predictions as to how it could impact your possessions. But I think that's an open question, and we haven't yet looked at your feelings of psychological ownership towards the things purchased with borrowed money. Yeah, and I think that could be really interesting too in terms of when you borrow items, right? When you do rent the runway, right? What's your psychological ownership there, or something like that? Yeah, and so as
Steph,
I mentioned,
can I jump in with one other
yeah,
idea here?
sure.
And I'm happy to hear your thoughts on it. But one thought I had was maybe there's something about credit worthiness or deservingness, or something I did to deserve this. This reflects me and who I am. If I get a credit line, it's because I'm doing the right things. If I get a loan, it's because I signed up for a loan. And I'm just wondering if there's something about, you know, a self-causal kind of or self-reflective nature of this ownership, where if I did something to deserve it, it's mine. And so, for example, you can imagine a manipulation with the loans, where rather than highlighting the bank, you could actually highlight the collateral and say, hey, because you have this big house, we can give you a line of credit against it. So it really comes from your possessions or something you did or some good behavior of yours in the past, because your credit score is so high, and somehow highlight their own behavior. Would we get kind of higher psychological ownership?
I think that's a great question. We have tried to just like tell people the loan was their money more, and we don't see that works very effectively. I'll show you an extension that we're doing with government benefits, in which we can increase the psychological ownership of tax credit. But we've also found that there may be boundaries to this, and one of those for us so far had been loans. And so I love the idea that like maybe what you need to do is make people believe like there's another behavior that's caused this, because I think directly going into the loan and trying to like reconceptualize the loan hasn't been very effective. But I think that's really consistent with the idea that self-identity can be a driver of psychological ownership, right? And to the extent that you deserve this and that you're getting it because you're a good person and it reflects positively on you or something like that, I think that could be a really interesting lever. And I also think that just speaks to how multiply determined this construct likely is, and how the specific targets in question may be really important to consider in thinking about what those drivers are, because it might not be the same across all different types of debt. Right. And so I love that idea. We haven't yet looked at that, but I can absolutely see how, like, based on what we know about psychological ownership, that might impact it. Yeah. And that, I mean, I think that directly goes to the first point here, which is that, you know, we are still trying to understand this. This has really been about, you know, does psychological ownership of borrowed money exist? Is it different from other things? Is it predictive, right? Why should we care about this? But again, we see this as like the tip of the iceberg in terms of our understanding of it. And I think there's a lot of questions about what are the key factors that contribute to these perceptions of psychological ownership. And I think that's really important in understanding how can we change then people's psychological ownership, right? And of course, you know, as we've been doing this, you know, we've wanted to try some things out, but there's always this tension between wanting to test something and also not wanting to encourage people to go into debt, which is why we've primarily focused on reducing interest in credit card borrowing as opposed to increasing interest in loan borrowing. But there are times where, you know, if you could get people to use a lower interest product like a personal loan, it might be more beneficial than a credit card. And so those are those are some really interesting things to tackle, I think. I'm going to skip past parts of these just because I want to get to the last field study with the last couple of minutes remaining. But you know, I just want to mention, right, that there are dynamic processes, other potential outcomes of this. And then as Suzanne brought up earlier, right, this isn't just about borrowed money. I think it's really interesting in terms of borrowed money. I think there's a lot of work that can be done on borrowed money, but you can imagine a lot of different types of money that could be influenced by psychological ownership perceptions. And this is what we're looking at now with the earned income tax credit. And this is actually work with an amazing PhD student, Wendy De La Rosa, who I work with at Stanford, as well as Isha Sharma. And we're doing this in collaboration with Code for America. Code for America is a nonprofit organization aimed at helping low-income families get benefits that they need. And so the earned income tax credit is something that's made available to low-income families. And it's a tax credit they earn. However, in America, about 1 in 5 families don't claim this, even though they qualify for it. And in California, where we ran this study, about 1 in 4 families don't claim it. So 25% of families who are eligible for this don't actually claim this. And so we wanted to see whether psychological ownership could help claim tax benefits. And so we wanted to look at whether trying to increase their psychological ownership of these funds could increase the likelihood that they would click to actually fill out and collect this money. And we also wanted to explore the relative effectiveness of this intervention relative to other potential known nudges. And so this was done with 10,000 individuals who qualified for the earned income tax credit based on the information that Code for America has, and it was pre-registered on as predicted. So we had 4 different conditions. We had a control condition, which just gave the general information. We believe you're eligible for a tax credit, and Code for America imputed the amount that they believed that they were owed and included that in the message. It said it's easy to file. If you haven't filed your taxes yet, you can do it online for free. And it has the website that Code for America provides to actually allow them to do their taxes and helps them claim this credit. Then we added a psychological ownership intervention. And this one said, we believe you have a tax credit that belongs to you. It's easy to file to get your money, same information. We also added a deadline condition. So we ran this study the week before the filing deadline, and we reminded people to file before the deadline. And then we had a norms condition in which we told them that millions of people like them had already filed their taxes. So how does this work? So in the control condition, about 18% of participants clicked to go to the website. And the psychological ownership condition, this increased to 32%. And now we've actually run a couple of replications of this with slightly different wording, and we find similar effect sizes across that wording. How does this relate to the other types of interventions? Well, the deadline condition did increase the likelihood that they clicked, but less effectively than the psychological ownership manipulation. And in this case, the norms manipulation was not effective at increasing their likelihood of clicking. And so psychological ownership actually outperformed all of the other conditions. And I think this really speaks to the potential power of psychological ownership in determining financial behaviors. And with that, I think we're out of time. So I just want to thank you all for joining, and a special thanks to all of my amazing collaborators, Isha Sharma, Cindy Kreider, and Wendy De La Rosa. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you so much, Steph, for presenting all this work. Really interesting. And thanks to all of our audience for being so engaged and submitting so many questions, and to Isha for answering so many of them, while she was also vigilantly paying attention to Steph's talk. So thanks to everyone. We will be back again next week. So join us then. Thanks.